We've all had that moment where we hear the backstory of an evil villain and can't help but feel badly for them. That uncanny feeling where you can't help but reserve a bit of sympathy for their cause and even find yourself rooting for them in some strange way. Personally, I think that's a sign of a really good villain, one that's both deplorable and kind of lovable at the same time. So I thought, why not put together a list of a few of them for your viewing pleasure. So here are the top 10 most lovable Marvel villains. At number 10 is Ego from the Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Although this guy is a real piece of work through and through, there's no denying that he's got the energy of a dude that could be fun to be around. I don't think he has any emotional depth, and he was an absolutely horrible father to Peter Quill, but that doesn't mean he wouldn't be a likable, lovable, maybe drinking buddy or acquaintance to hang out with from time to time. And, share stories with about the universe. Played in the movie by Kurt Russell, this guy's charisma is pretty entrancing and almost manipulative. Almost. Maybe deep down somewhere he's got some level of humanity that would at least allow him to kick back and hang out for a little while. And listen, I know what you're thinking. He's not even a person. He's an illusion that plays to Star-Lord's insecurities, and I get that. So fine. I'll say that the person Ego is personifying here seems somewhat lovable, like number 10 on the list level. Hey, remember the standards are pretty low here. Remember, these are the lovable villains, right? That bar is low. At number 9 is Sandman. This is one of those cases where William Flint Baker's backstory is just a little too sad not to feel something for the guy. Flint grew up pretty impoverished and with very little stability. His mother was an alcoholic and his dad didn't seem to be around much, which led to Flint acting up at school. He had his heart broken at a young age after having a crush on one of his teachers, an experience that convinced him that he needed money to be worthy of love. And on top of it all, he was bullied as a kid, which is always tragic no matter how you look at it. Now, I don't want to make this entry a big sob story because Sandman is still an evil dude, but when someone has such a tough upbringing, it's hard to hold it entirely against them. Circumstance plays a big role in bringing this guy to a life of villainy, and it's hard not to feel badly for him for that reason. This sentiment is played out a number of times in the comics and even in the character's tone in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. One time in the comics, Sandman even turns to the good side briefly and even gets an Avengers membership. And although he does go back to a life of crime in the end, this stint as a good guy just proves that Flint always had it in him to be loved. At number 8 is Modok Superior. Although this version of the villain is known to be more of a hero than anything, it is argued that the only reason for his heroic tendencies are due to a crush he has on Parul Kurinji, or 01. And honestly, this is one of the reasons why I find Modok Superior to be somewhat lovable as a character. Personally, when he's being evil and showing very few signs of humanity, him being an egg-shaped head strapped into a robotic suit makes me dislike him quite a bit, which I think is part of the character. But when he's an egg-shaped head strapped into a robotic suit and he's got a crush on someone, then I start feeling sort of badly for him. And considering it's a crush strong enough to make him basically turn good, it proves that this little dude actually has a heart somewhere in that head of his, and that maybe all along this little dude just needed some love. Although I don't think that love is going to come from 01, let's just be honest, but there are plenty of other fish in the sea that would love your weird vibe, Modok. Just gotta keep yourself open. At number 7 we have Mysterio from the MCU. Okay, this entry is more about Jake Gyllenhaal than the actual character himself, so bear with me here. I just really love Gyllenhaal's portrayal of this classic Spider-Man villain, and I think it really brings out the humanity in a character that can tend to come off a bit one note in the comics. I'm not saying you need to love his portrayal too, maybe you weren't a fan, but without generating a ton of sympathy and without having a gut-wrenching backstory, Mysterio still strikes me as a lovable character in this portrayal. He has a pretty straightforward motivation for doing what he does, being a disgruntled former employee at Stark Industries, but it's not about that for me. It's more about how he carries himself, and I just love his powers. He gains my respect, I'll call it respect, through his sheer ingenuity and his ability to really challenge such an otherwise untouchable superhero like Spider-Man. I have moments where I'm not rooting for him, but where I'm genuinely interested to see what kind of illusion he comes up with next. And I think maybe I'd even say he's lovable for that reason. Also, he's not so evil that I deeply hate him, so he's sort of surface level sour and misguided, so there's room for some level of respect, at least for me. At number 6 is Killmonger. Killmonger is a pretty bad dude, but he's got a ton of humanity and he makes it hard not to reserve some sense of love for him. Just like T'Challa, Killmonger's father dies and this changes his whole life, and he begins to cultivate a deep resentment and lust for vengeance. But since his father was killed by his own brother, Killmonger turns to his own family as the target for his revenge. This is where he makes a mistake and gives in to his evil, but his anger is still somewhat understandable. Actually, entirely understandable, speaking of his anger, not his actions. To anyone witnessing Eric Stevens' downfall, anger seems like a natural emotion to feel, but he does the classic villain thing and gives into his vengeance, taking out his personal feelings on others, acting on twisted philosophies, all that good stuff. And although he's misguided, his intentions still were and always have been to try and empower his people. Just like his father, he's always been all for using the vast deposits of vibranium buried beneath Wakanda to help his fellow Wakandans fight back. But we all know that violence is not the way, and this leaves Killmonger in the villain category. At number 5 is Bucky Barnes, aka the Winter Soldier. This is a pretty obvious one. Anyone who knows this backstory knows that the Winter Soldier is actually a very honorable American soldier who is simply brainwashed by Hydra. And although he does some pretty bad stuff in his run as a villain, somewhere deep down we all know that if he were in his right mind, he wouldn't be doing any of this. Much of the time we hold villains to a high enough standard that all their villainous actions are seen as a set of failures to do the right thing. And even then, we have the capacity to feel badly for them when they fall short of our expectations. So how can we not feel badly for a guy who has zero control over his actions whatsoever? Someone who has been synthetically altered to do evil, especially when he used to be Captain America's partner. I mean, they fought in World War II together and Bucky always had Steve's back. There's nothing more lovable than a true friend in the darkest of times, right? Luckily, Bucky Barnes has come around since this stint as a villain and came to his senses, so we can feel less conflicted when showing him love nowadays. At number 4 is Thanos. Now, Thanos is such a powerful and intimidating figure that lovable may not be the best word to describe him, but I still felt that I needed to put him on this list. Now, speaking of humanity, Thanos has a surprising amount of it considering he is so far from human, and his history and motivations seem to actually make us feel badly for him in some cases. Even though his intentions tend to be things like, you know, destroying half of humanity, and he's basically a tyrannical, abusive, and extremely violent dictator, somehow we feel like he's actually got some kind of a soul deep down. Just a very, very, very damaged soul. It may be something about the way he carries himself. He seems really smart and collected a lot of the time, and sometimes even acts as though he wishes he didn't have to do the things he does. But if you know his original backstory, you might feel even worse for him, knowing he was rejected by his parents as a baby. And not only that, but he was to be killed by a Ghost Rider there and then. But it gets worse. He was then instead taken in under the Ghost Rider's wing and basically bred to become an evil dictator. Knowing this, it seems like he had no choice in how he turned out. But then again, he does kill his own mother when he's just a teenager along with a group of his own people, so I don't know, maybe he's just lovable in comparison to how awful he is? I think on this list it's more of a ratio of how bad they really are measured against how much sympathy we can reserve for them. So since there's even a little bit for Thanos, knowing how bad he is, put him higher on the list. Does that make sense? At number 3 is Vulture, or Adrian Toomes from the MCU. Appearing in Spider-Man Homecoming, this guy is a really cool and genuinely lovable villain because although he does the typical bad guy thing where he lets his anger turn him to violence, his anger comes from a fair place. Toomes is a middle-class, hardworking American who finds work in the salvaging business, cleaning up New York City with his team who he seems to genuinely care for. But when he learns that billionaire Tony Stark has already teamed up with the government to clean up the city after each giant, massively destructive Avengers battle, they take business away from Toomes and his guys. This leaves Toomes feeling like Stark is the bad guy and he needs to do something himself to stop him, which honestly is sort of understandable. In fact, in the comics they even acknowledge Iron Man's shortcomings of undervaluing the average people of the world. So Adrian really isn't that far off, and this is a really poignant and relatable message for many people. The giant corporation taking away honest honest work from average citizens. Honestly, this is one of the first times when I actually felt like I could see myself in Adrian Toome's position. He seems so helpless, and his character development goes deep into his family, showing that he really has a heart and is just trying to provide for his family. He does do some bad stuff, but it's hard not to understand where this guy is coming from sometimes. And nearing the top of the list at number 2, we have the one and only Magneto. Even without Magneto's awful and heart-wrenching backstory, he is one of those characters that just has a misguided philosophy. He's one of those guys where you know that somewhere along the line, his perspective went from maybe even respectable and understanding to dark and unpalatable. But when you look deeper into his origins and his experience in the Holocaust, you have no choice but to feel like he was just dealt an extremely bad hand. And that knowledge, paired with the fact that a lot of the time he isn't even that evil, he ranks as one of the most lovable Marvel villains in my opinion. Besides, he used to be best pals with Professor X and has even saved his life before. On top of this, Magneto's whole philosophy that leads him to making questionable decisions is all based on his love for mutants, which is the same love that Professor X has for them. Except Magneto is just quite a bit less tolerant of humanity's mistreatment of mutants than Charles Xavier is. It's really not hard to picture yourself feeling the same way if you were in Magneto's shoes. At number 1 is Loki. Do I even need to expound on this one? Loki is pretty unanimously seen as a tragic case of the less loved sibling, and his actions tend to always reflect this insecurity, regardless of his justifications for his own anger. He's just a sour dude, and for pretty good reasons, if we're being honest. I mean, with normal sibling rivalries, at least there's ambiguity as to who might be considered the favorite or who might be the most competent. There are plenty of different avenues to explore to prove to yourself that you're good enough. But when there's a hammer that symbolizes whether or not you are good enough for your father's approval, when that hammer can only be lifted up by the one who daddy loves most, then you've got yourself a whole lifetime of insecurities to deal with. You've got yourself a challenge, maybe even greater than any that Thor might face in his whole lifetime, to find a way to feel like you belong, that you deserve to be loved. You've got Loki. And if you're asking me, he does a pretty damn good job holding it together, all things considered. Sure, he takes advantage of almost every situation he finds himself in for personal gain, if not for the sheer joy of trickery, but he always seems to come back around and remind us that he's really just looking for somebody to accept him for who he is. So I put him at number 1 on this list, because even if you may not agree with me, I think he deserves a little more love from us than he typically gets from his own people. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. That was my list for today. How'd you feel about my list? Do you guys want to talk about it in the comments? Feel free to do so. I will answer you. I'll do my best to reply to you. Thanks so much for watching. This has been Top 10 Nerd. I've been your host, Ben Ball. See you next time.